Welcome to this Our Burning Planet webinar, Battleground Antarctica, the fight to defend Earth's unmined frontier. I'm Tiara Walters, an investigative reporter with Daily Maverick's Climate Crisis Unit, Our Burning Planet. Thanks to our sponsors, APSA, for making this webinar possible. Thanks to you, the viewer, for tuning in. Today, we are talking about mining and what it means for the future of Antarctica, Earth's icy climate control room, which covers 10% of the planet. Antarctica is Earth's unmined frontier. Can green campaigners defend it? If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Simpiwe, our webinar angel, and I will have a look out for them. But first, it's a special welcome to our expert guest, Jim Barnes in France, newly returned from a trip to Antarctica. As the founder of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, or ASOC, and the person who led the decades-long campaign that gave us Antarctica's 1998 mining ban, there can be no better person than Jim to guide us through these controversial issues. Welcome to you, Jim.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jim, I'd like to begin with a quick recap of Our Burning Planet's investigations over 2.5 years, just to bring people up to speed. It all began in August 2020, when we photographed the Kremlin's Antarctic seismic vessel, the academic Alexander Karpinsky, in Cape Town port, an official Antarctic gateway. At the time, this vessel and her seismic airguns had never been exposed by Western popular media. But as we found, the Karpinsky and her deafening airguns had never stopped looking for oil and gas in the Southern Ocean. And though Russia has repeatedly told us all of this is just science, we have also found multiple Kremlin sources claiming there are 500 billion barrels of oil and gas beneath the warming Southern Ocean. The Russians did not say how much of it was recoverable, but they had used Cape Town as a launch pad ever since Antarctica's 1998 mining ban entered into force. Next, in December 2022, we exposed Antarctic underwater noise. And when the Karpinsky turned up in Cape Town this January, she sparked the first historic rallies against Antarctic underwater noise. Cape Town Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis said Russian state vessels were not welcome in his city. The Democratic Alliance, the official opposition, challenged the ANC to come clean about its Antarctic alliances. Environment Minister Barbara Creasy, in parliamentary questions, claimed she had not heard of prospecting or seismic blasting in East Antarctica, but she suggested South Africa was working on a plan to strengthen the mining ban. We have asked for details and we await them still. Jim, these are extraordinary developments. Because Antarctica is protected by the 55-state 1959 Antarctic Treaty, this is supposed to devote this wilderness to peaceful ideals such as tourism and old school science. And Russia has done a lot of old school, proper legal science in Antarctica. Russia found subglacial Lake Vostok, which has transformed our view of what exists below Antarctica's vast ice sheet. So we should give credit where it's due. But Jim, my question to you is, Germany has blasted over more than 60,000 kilometers in Antarctic seabed for a range of legal marine sciences. But the Kremlin's mineral explorer, Rosgeo, has blasted across 140,000 kilometers of Antarctic seabed while sailing under the flag of the Russian Antarctic Expedition, the State Polar Program. So that's 60,000 versus 140,000 kilometers or more. So, Jim, would you say that Russia is in a class of its own here?
Well, I think it definitely is. In every case, we have to look at what the purpose of the research is. And in the Antarctic Treaty System, every country, because it's an open science system in theory and mostly in practice, they're supposed to tell all the other parties what they're actually doing, what their goals are, and what they've found, and so forth. So for the German programs, again, I'm not deeply aware of every detail about these programs, but I watch them. Our team watches them fairly carefully and reads all the papers at each Antarctic Treaty meeting. And Germany's been very good about saying, well, here's the purpose of our research, here's what we found. And I'd like to get to the airgun issue separately, if you don't mind. But Russia basically has not been very open about telling us, at least not since 2002, I think it is, why they're doing this and what their goals are and what they hope to achieve from it. So I definitely put Russia in a different category on those two levels, the size and extent and the failure to tell people in the proper way what they're actually doing and what they're finding.
I'd like to get to the data exchange issue in a few minutes, but perhaps all of this is best framed by the keywords of Antarctic mining politics. So, for the sake of our audience, let's just take a moment. The treaty's environmental protocol is widely known as the Madrid Protocol. This protocol includes the 1998 mining ban, or Article 7, as it's formally known. So, those key words, the Madrid Protocol and its Article 7, entered into force in 1998. Article 7 bans all mineral resource activities, except scientific research. Article 7 never expires, ever, not even in 2048, the most quoted date in polar politics. So you, the viewer, might ask, what could go wrong? Well, if one of the Antarctic Treaty's decision-making powers calls for a review from 2048 onwards, then Article 7 and its ban can be weakened, even perhaps lifted after jumping through a number of hoops. Jim, you are an environmental lawyer. Perhaps no one understands Antarctic law better than the lawyer who led the charge to stop the pact that wanted to facilitate mining there. That is, in case it did happen. And Jim, recently in an online comment, you said, and I'm going to quote, all Antarctic Treaty governments know that Russia is violating the environmental protocol's ban on minerals exploration, but so far have done nothing. Now, there's a lot to unpack, but let's start with this. Why do you believe Russia is violating the ban on minerals exploration?
Well, I'm pretty sure for a number of reasons, starting with the thing we talked about a minute ago. What is their objective? In the earlier 2002 document, and I believe you have the history of that document, they're very clear. They're looking for oil and gas deposits. Then you look at the size of the seismic tracts, the number of tracts, and so forth. If you're doing, let's call it real scientific research, the intensity of your seismic activity, the narrowness of the tracts, and so forth doesn't have to be so precise. But if you're looking for oil and gas deposits, there's a number of criteria that pop up in what you're doing. So the reason I say that they're violating the Article 7, is I think they're carrying out minerals exploration activities, and that's not seen as regular science. It's a little difficult for maybe the layperson to parse all these things, but in the Antarctic Treaty system, if you want to have your science vetted and approved and acknowledged as true science, then you have to submit detailed reports every year or two to keep all the other treaty parties apprised of what you're doing, and that hasn't happened here. So again, I'm a person who believes if you're hiding something, there's usually a reason why you're hiding something. And then the second thing I would say is that a number of governments that I've spoken with over the last several years acknowledge they're worried too. They don't think this is pure science. but they're hesitant to say so for various reasons. We can get into those reasons if you want to.
That would be, I think, very valuable for our viewers. In terms of the data exchange issue, to the best of my knowledge, the data has been very limited in terms of being tabled at Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. But Russian scientists have declared the results of their work to the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research. But there are contradictions. They've quite bizarrely described Antarctica's mineral resource potential in their 2001 EIA, so that's the Environmental Impact Assessment. So even though one can say that's a weak defense, in a 2002 ATCM info paper, they argued that geology and prospecting overlapped and that oil and gas assessments did not immediately threaten Antarctica. But in an early draft of that paper, Jim, which we have seen and published, the following paragraph was not yet deleted. That said, scientific mineral resource assessments are fully consistent with Article 7 and agree with the national geological tradition requiring the mineral resource characterization of the study region, if even the activities related to actual utilization of Antarctic mineral wealth may only occur in the indefinitely remote future. So here, they are not ruling out exploitation, even in the context of their scientific geology work. So at times they have put data on the table, but perhaps these arguments have holes that remain unchallenged by the data scrutineers.
Well, definitely. I mean, there's a number of smoke screens here, I would argue. If you're wanting to be totally honest and open about your science research, then you're going to publish detailed papers. They're going to be peer reviewed. They're going to be published in journals. They're going to be translated and so forth and made available, more than just a kind of reference point, which is what has happened, I think, at the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research over the years. Yeah, there have been some references to what they're doing, but there's never been the basis for what I would call a real discussion in the Scientific Committee or on the other levels, the political level. And without that information being put forward in the proper way, we can't even have that discussion. We can only have it if another country wanted to challenge Russia formally on this. And that hasn't happened. I mean, that hasn't happened for lots of reasons. One is that there's so many other issues on the table every year. And you have a limited bandwidth as a government or as an NGO or a scientist, whatever, to deal with different issues. I mean, I just mentioned fishing, for example. There's a lot of fishing going on in Antarctica, and these governments, if they were really interested in science research, would help us understand the ecosystem implications of taking out these massive quantities of toothfish and krill and ice fish and so forth. Russia chooses not to invest any serious research efforts in those areas, even though it wants to fish a lot. So you put all this stuff into the balance, and you have to say, yeah, you can claim this is just normal geological research, but with the backdrop of the original goals outlined, and always in the not in the back of mind, in the front of the mind, knowing what is the oil and gas potential of Antarctica. Why do we want to know that? Is it just a scientific curiosity? I doubt that very much. I think most people would doubt that. No, if you're wanting to know what the oil and gas potential is, even in the face of global climate change of a proportion we can barely understand now, it just doesn't make any sense. And again, we can go into more details about some of this stuff, but that's my conclusion.
We have a question here, Jim, from Kimberly Aiken. Kimberly asks, should we be worried about increasing interest to mine Antarctica not just from Russia, but by others, when the treaty system revisits the mining ban in 2048, or I imagine potentially revisits the mining ban in 2048?
Well, I think in a broad sense, I'm concerned about any country that is, let's say, investing its scarce scientific research capabilities and assets and resources in looking for things like oil and gas and minerals. And so in that sense, Russia, I believe, is not alone. There are several other countries that seem to be very interested in the potential of various minerals. To my knowledge, Russia is the only one that's really continuing to look for oil and gas, but that's maybe wrong. Maybe there are countries doing it secretly, and we don't know about it. But what we would like to see is the wonderful array of scientists and their scientific resources and assets put to work to understand the ecosystems of Antarctica, to protect them. That's the mission of the protocol. The protocol, even Camelar, the fishing arrangement, their missions are protection and conservation. Even the fisheries Camelar is not really upfront in its formulation, its key articles about exploiting fish. There's a lot of exploitation going on at the same time, and I'm not happy about a lot of it because it's not really science-based. But we need to roll up our sleeves as a global community of stewards. After all, the Antarctic Treaty parties volunteered to be stewards for all the Antarctic. They don't own it, but they agreed to be the stewards going forward. And they've made many, many commitments and promises in these treaties and otherwise. And to do that, they need to step up to the plate and invest their scientific resources in the conservation and protection side of life, and not on the exploitation side of life.
Jim, you touched on the thorny issue of definitions within the Antarctic Treaty system. The cornerstones are not defined by Antarctic law. Science and prospecting are not defined in the Antarctic Treaty System's agreements. And yet, a South African paper published in Nature last year described how Southern ocean storms release atmosphere heating gases. It's gas, but no one can argue it's not really important, worthy legal science. And surely no rational person can disagree that prospecting refers to, say, any activity aimed at identifying or assessing the quantity, quality, or location of any mineral resources. So why did the Madrid Protocol's drafters not define these things? Did they want to avoid controversy?
No, I don't think so. I think at the time they were so driven by the need to fill what they saw as a gap, because their minerals convention had fallen apart, was blocked at first, as I think you know, by France and Australia, and then quickly a lot of other countries joined the group that said no mining and no drilling, etc. So in a sense, the Minerals Convention, known often by its acronym CRAMRA, pretty bad acronym, but that's what it is. It sits on a dark shelf somewhere in a closet. It was signed but never ratified, or never legally enforced. And in CRAMRA, they had gone to great lengths, well, some lengths, maybe not great lengths, but some lengths to do exactly what you're saying, to describe the difference between prospecting and scientific research. And so in a broad sense, that learning, that information, that thinking is still there, and it could be drawn on, but by them if they chose to. But in the protocol, the main objectives were so different. They were to find what was the formulation to come up with it. ASOC and all of our partner groups wanted to have a complete forever ban. And a number of countries, including France and Australia and Belgium and Italy and a lot of others, agreed with that. But at the end of the day, to gain consensus on the final version of the protocol, we had to come up with the moratorium language. And if people read the moratorium lifting language, I'll call it, carefully, they'll see that it's a very complicated procedure and uses qualified majorities. It's a multi-step procedure. But if anybody really did want to carry out exploitation true exploration and exploitation, essentially they would have to reenact a new CRAMRA, a new minerals convention. And presumably they would put those definitions, they would leave those definitions there and probably even elucidate them and strengthen them. But at the moment of the protocol negotiation, the key issue was, how do we formulate this, what became the moratorium? And then along the way, what about all the annexes we need to set up legally binding requirements for everything from protecting species, the marine environment, waste disposal, all of which, let's remind ourselves, were totally unregulated. The waste disposal scene in Antarctica in 1991 was pathetic, horrible. Countries were still basically moving almost all their trash, even their toxic trash, out into the ocean. Some were even using explosives to blow up it on the ice and sink it to the bottom, like the U.S. did in McMurdo Sound. So there were lots of things that had to focus on regulating. And then we mentioned tourism just briefly, but a lot of countries wanted to regulate tourism, which was one of the major activities. Sadly, that couldn't be gained by consensus, so the French proposal for an Article 6 was dropped eventually, and that's where we are today. Perhaps that's enough on that, but ask me more questions.
Yes. Jim, you mentioned CRAMRA and the potential legal precedent that it retains. Or we can call it the Wellington Convention, which is slightly easier to pronounce. You fought a battle against this and you won, so you understand this very well. And it says, I'm going to actually quote from my notes, CRAMRA says, or the Wellington Convention says, prospecting aims to identify areas of mineral resource potential for possible exploration and development. Right. And that definition is particularly relevant because Roscoe, the Russian explorer, admits in state documents it has and will continue doing just that. In a December 2022 report, it said its research goals include, I'm quoting the professional English translation, the creation of an information base for the assessment and scientific forecast of the mineral raw material potential of the Antarctic. That's a classic CRAMRA definition. So if I may, a hypothetical thought experiment. Is it possible to take Antarctic Treaty states to the International Court of Justice and say, 19 of you, including Russia and South Africa, which offers these port facilities for Russia, signed the 1988 Mining Pact. This is still open for accession. You agreed on its definitions and you signed up to Madrid, which requires all states to enforce compliance under Article 13. So now you must do something.
Well, again, I have to unpack this a little bit, but yeah, people could try to take anybody to the International Criminal Court if they wanted to. I just don't think it's going to work in this case for two reasons. The first is, although the language that you just quoted, and I fully agree that what's going on now meets that so-called definition in the Wellington Convention, but it wasn't ratified. It's not legally enforced. It's not therefore binding. And as a matter of international law, as interesting as what they were attempting to do is, I don't see any court saying you're bound by that. What needs to happen, it seems to me, is for the treaty parties to, again, step up to the plate and make very clear now do they still adhere, for example, to that definition? And it would be a simple matter to bring it to the floor of the Antarctic Treaty consultative meeting and pass a measure. They could have which is in the treaty context about as binding as you can get. You can have resolutions and recommendations and guidelines, but if you pass a conservation measure that buttresses Article 7 and says, this is what we meant when we wrote these words, and this is the kind of research that really is research, and this is the activity, these are activities that are not that research. But I have to say, I just don't think that the idea of going to the International Criminal Court will lead anywhere. And I'm always conscious of people's scarce resources, the resources of energy, money, time, and so forth. So at least in ASOC, we have to choose carefully how we use our resources. And that's one reason why we probably wouldn't be involved in going to the criminal court. But it'll be an interesting debate up there, and it'll be fun to see what the judges might say.
Yes, and we have some successful precedents at the International Court of Justice through scientific whaling, right?
Right, sure. Yeah.
I'd like to go to some comments here, and I would like to read James Way Jones's comment. He says, mineral and oil exploration and overfishing in Antarctica, apart from environmentally catastrophic, would be extremely expensive and challenging logistically. It would be difficult to transport oil and gas and minerals, and ice is so challenging. It likely has to be strategic and militarily inclined. Shipping, control of resources, and future strategy would have to be involved. Make new laws under the seas must always carry sustainability reports, all of it with in-depth studies. Request the details under international law of all peer-reviewed scientific research from the Russian Federation, and if they do not, can they be excluded as a member to any treaty, be banned and be excluded in the interests of life on planet Earth? Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but James touches on a number of issues that are relevant. It is very difficult to mine the Antarctic if ever you were going to go that route. So let's first talk about that. Jim, realistically, what do you think are the chances of the Antarctic being open to any kind of, and we're not just talking about oil and gas, any kind of exploitation in this quite destabilized world between now and 2048?
Well, I think the chances of any state, especially any Antarctic Treaty member state, violating the terms of the existing prohibition in Article 7 of the protocol are very, very low. For an Antarctic Treaty state to do that, they would be probably suspended or kicked out of the treaty. They'd be a pariah internationally. The UN would be very unhappy with that. We can't forget the history of the General Assembly debates on the question of Antarctica in the 80s, for example, which was a key turning point in the world's understanding of why it was important to save Antarctica from that kind of industrial activity. But the politics also were very interesting and would remain very difficult for a rogue Antarctic Treaty state. Is there another non-Antarctic Treaty state that might try that? Well, of course, there's always that potential. But I believe if that ever happened, that the Antarctic Treaty member states, which are now in the 40s, counting the non-consultative parties, would, as a group, come out in various ways to block that or try to block it. So I'm not too worried about what happens before 2048 in terms of actually starting activities there. In terms of the difficulty, of course, we went through this whole debate back in the 1980s. And that didn't stop the oil companies from taking their very preliminary seismic tracks back in those days from the late 70s and early 80s. And as late as 1985 or 6, if you had $10,000, you could buy one of the petroleum companies involved estimation then, based on their tracking at that point about the potential and where it was located and so forth. I never paid for one, but somebody gave me one, and I could see you'd be a stupid oil company if you actually use that to think I'm going to get something down there, because of all the points that James mentions. Be very, very expensive and so forth. And well, I'll stop there and we can talk about some other part of this question if you want to then.
Yes, and as impractical and as egregious as Antarctic mining might seem to many, Russia has been down there in the Southern Ocean for at least 25 years, extensively looking at oil and gas. They have been really quite explicit about their intentions in their shipping diaries in Russian, published in Russian on their website. So as much as the issue seems impractical, Russia, which has displayed a flagrant disregard for international law, it remains in a class of its own. I suppose in many ways it's the last state that one wants to be in a class of its own when it comes to this issue.
It's in a class of its own on this issue and a number of others, obviously, and the war is one of the most horrific things that we're facing on Earth right now, and it has enormous and negative implications for all sorts of arrangements and treaty arrangements and so forth. The Antarctic Treaty system, I can certainly tell you from our own personal experiences the last couple of years, is extremely unhappy with what Russia is doing in Ukraine. But there's no way to kick Russia out of the treaty. And maybe that would be counterproductive anyway, because my view is that you're always better off to have people somehow in the ambit of your discussion than just sitting totally excluded on the outside. But the treaty meetings have been extremely awkward the last year in particular, and the ones coming up are not going to be any better. And that's one reason why we didn't get much discussion last year on the paper we put forward, raising the question of, wouldn't it be a smart thing to put off limits now and forever any potential, which would do two things. It would lift the curtain of ambiguity about 2048, and it would help countries change their direction and the focus of their so-called science programs and their real science programs. Why would anybody want to invest in looking for oil and gas and minerals if we put it out of bounds now? And so that logic I thought was very powerful, and it was satisfying on a philosophical level, an ethical level, and so forth. But under the circumstances of last year's treaty meeting, as I think everybody could understand, there wasn't any appetite for taking it up. Now, might there be appetite in future years after the war is ended and so forth? Maybe. And I think it's a good discussion to keep having, because right now the possibility that there could be minerals exploitation in the future bends the curve of scientific activities in Antarctica in the wrong direction. It gives incentives to some countries, some states, to do things that arguably are not in their own self-interest or anybody's self-interest, but something is leading them to do that. If we take that option off the table completely, then they won't have any reason to dream that dream. Maybe they can think of more important dreams.
Jim, you touched on this unchangeable ban, or making the ban unmodifiable. I know this goes against every grain of your being and what you've worked for, but respected scholars like Dua Abdel-Mutal, in her recent book, The Battle for the Seventh Continent, have said it's better to regulate these activities than hoping they will just go away. And if we don't resurrect the Wellington Convention, okay, what is the alternative? And you referred to this. Last year, ASOP proposed scrapping 2048, thus ensuring the ban can never be changed. So surely, if mining Antarctica is as hard as some say, it must be an easy way for states not to disagree and revitalize diplomacy by adopting an unchangeable ban. And we know that it's critical to revitalize diplomacy within that space because it's had a huge hammering in the past decade.
Yeah, well, one would think all those things. It should be easy. I thought it might be easy. I was wrong. It's not that easy. I don't know whether more states than just, say, Russia and China harbor illusions about what riches can be taken from Antarctica. It's possible. I mean, but I'm not privy, and I don't think any of my colleagues are privy to the deep desires or the deepest desires of various nation states. And there's always this, long-term greed. I hesitate to use that word, but I will use it. There's a greed that supersedes our commitments to protect places. And that's why the Antarctic is so special, it seems to me. All the treaties about Antarctica are focused on science, real science, and conservation and environmental protection. And if we could keep ourselves as countries focused on those missions, those are our missions as stewards, etc. We accepted these. We signed up to them. So let's implement them. Let's invest in those and not have these, I think, rather silly dreams. And picking up James's earlier point, again, if one ever did have the chance to go down and mine or drill or whatever, it would be very difficult, very, very expensive. So these are really, in my view, dreams. They're illusions that are leading to a misappropriation of very scarce science resources. And for the future of the planet and the future of Antarctica, we need to use those resources in the best way so we really understand the true reality of the deep ocean around Antarctica, just like on the high seas. We're going to finally have a new regime there, which is great. But not in Antarctica. To put these illusions to rest would be a great thing if we can accomplish it. So maybe we can come back to it in a few years in the Antarctic Treaty System once the Ukraine war is over and people can think more clearly again.
Okay, so let's say this is just an illusion. There does still seem to be an unanswered question around compliance, around the principle of the old school sticking to the law. I would like to read a comment by Professor Alan Hemmings of Canterbury University in New Zealand. Professor Hemmings is a well-known governance scholar, and he says the definition of the components of mineral resource activity, including prospecting, was so recent and obvious that nobody thought it necessary to repeat these in the Madrid Protocol, but those definitions are there for those who look. So he says there is no ambiguity. And in that vein, Jim, I want to go back to your statement you made online recently. All Antarctic Treaty governments know that Russia is violating the ban. They know, all Antarctic Treaty governments know that Russia is violating the ban. That's quite a statement. But so far, they have done nothing. We have, to a certain extent, spoken about why they have done nothing. But Jim, do you think that they think oil and gas will be gone by 2050, even though best projections say that won't be the case? And are they happy to ignore statements by Russian scientists whom we've quoted, who spoke to us directly? They haven't retracted their statements, who suggest Madrid is a gentleman's agreement, those scientists have said to us that Russia's, the sanctions weathered by Russia at the moment, the war sanctions, did not change the potential of Antarctic mining in the longer term future. So, controversial question, as far as Antarctic states go. Is compliance less important than realpolitik? And as in, no one can challenge Russia. This issue is too complex. Let's just focus on something else. Let's ignore potential transgressions.
In the Antarctic Treaty System, like all treaties really, there's no police force. There's a court system, so to speak, but it's not much of a court system when you get down to it, because it's almost impossible to make use of the dispute resolution, which is what they would call their court system, and so forth. Compliance issues on any level are difficult to deal with. So just as an example, in the Antarctic Treaty System, everybody has the right, every consultative party has the right to go and inspect the facilities, the stations, the activities of any other state. Presumably, that's a compliance mechanism idea to let governments reassure themselves that bad things aren't happening or that their compliance is happening and so forth. But most countries never carry out any such inspections. Take the fishing thing. Even when we know for absolute fact that there is it's called a black vessel, that's what we call them, vessels that are fishing illegally outside the bounds of the rules of CAMLR and so forth. Even if you have the goods 100% about this vessel, it is almost impossible to do anything except use moral suasion by identifying the country and the boat. And even then, because of the consensus system, so we get that far several times in recent years, but the individual state, and at least a couple of times it was Russia, but there have been other countries as well, they can't stand to be named and shamed in public, and they insist that the words, their name, their country's name, and the boat's name be taken out of the final report. So compliance in any international regime is very difficult, and it comes down, I think, almost always to the willingness of the parties to use, again, this is probably not the best phrase, but I call it moral suasion, behind the scenes things often. A lot of things have been happening in heads of delegation meetings in recent years that we don't see reported, including on this fishing thing. There's no reason why those backdoor, closed-door heads of delegation discussions can't include this one, which is what I've urged. I've suggested to at least 3 countries, this is one way to deal with it. I understand why you may not want to formally debate this on the floor, but at least take it up in your heads of delegation meetings. And if we were living in more normal times, I think one or more of those countries would have done that. But again, these are not normal times, so it's not a good time to try to do that kind of stuff. But compliance, and maybe Alan Hemmings, who's on the call, can speak to this. He knows an awful lot about it. Coming up with compliance mechanisms is very, very difficult in any treaty situation, and that's just the way it is. I'm sorry that's the way it is. I wish it was better. I wish there was a sheriff. I wish there was an enforcement police force. But instead we have groups like ASOC, and we have Paul Watson with the Sea Shepherd, and we have Greenpeace going down with their vessels and stuff. At least they do find things. The best case of enforcement I know of in recent years was when the Sea Shepherd chased a pirate fishing boat halfway across the Southern Ocean and stopped it, and they gave up. No government has done that, So I'll stop there. But
yes. So I would actually like to. I would like to ask you 1 or 2 more questions from our audience. But in terms of driving this conversation forward, in terms of creating a sense of accountability, it seems to me as a reporter that there is a low level of accountability, public accountability within the Antarctic Treaty system. I say that because media are not allowed at Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, even though they are just as important as the UN COPs. That is quite an extraordinary fact. So media are not scrutinizing these issues. We reported on this before. And I think that there's a low level of Antarctic governance newsroom literacy. So very few journalists have the time and the support of their editors to pursue these issues. So if governments aren't accountable and if journalists are not investigating these issues, I guess in many ways it's the Antarctic is a regulated space, but there are major challenges there in terms of accountability. So what would it take for the sea shepherds of the world, or I guess anti-seismic protesters in South Africa, to create enough noise for governments to pay attention to the many issues facing this existentially threatened continent?
Well, these are great questions. Let me just take the first one you mentioned. So journalists are not allowed into the Antarctic Treaty meetings. And even those of us who are there are under very strict rules, protocols, if you will, about what we can do and when we can do it. That doesn't stop us from trying to tell the press in various ways what is going on. But we are circumscribed in various ways ourselves. And bear in mind that it only takes one country who decides that no longer can ASOC be an observer, and we're not even in the room ourselves. So I don't think that scares anybody, but it's something we keep in the back of our mind. So we've been pushing for years for journalists to be more involved, to be briefed properly, to have access to the realities of what's going on, and that has failed. Why has it failed? I think nobody has really taken it to a high enough level in any single government to gain a champion. You don't get change in these kinds of systems easily in any case, but if you don't have a champion state or two, you don't get anywhere. And my suggestion has been to various people, and I'll make it today, journalists in their various ways know how to talk to heads of government. You know how to make your points to heads of government. Just pick a couple, if South Africa, which is an important country in the Antarctic Treaty System, and another important country, let's just pick one like France, were to decide, or Australia, there's a group of these, that this is an important issue, that going forward, there needs to be more openness and transparency in the Antarctic Treaty System, and therefore journalists should be allowed to cover the proceedings, to report to the public, and educate and inform the public. And maybe it could be taken seriously, but to my knowledge, you don't have a champion, and therefore we don't have a champion. All of us who want to see accurate reporting, timely reporting, we don't get that. The final report that is issued by the treaty parties after any meeting is dense, dare I say opaque, hard to fathom, hard to understand the context of, laden with jargon and so forth. Usually one or more important parties comes out and has a short press conference. They're frankly never asked hard questions. It's up to journalists, I think, to also raise these issues to a higher level in ways that you can do, that I can't do, and be there. At least if there are more journalists actually sitting around a treaty meeting, like the one coming up in Helsinki, you can buttonhole people at receptions. You can talk to people as they come in and out of the buildings, all the usual stuff, and you can have a contingent of people at the final press conference and be upset, be angry, ask hard questions and stuff. Why didn't you do this? Why is this happening? But we need a lot more transparency and a lot more cutting through the opaque verbosity of these official reports. I can barely even stand to read one myself, and I think I'm speaking for a number of people who are on the are listening today, they are boring beyond belief. You have to look hard for the kernels of truth and the kernels of reality, so to speak, in the reports. Why isn't there an executive summary? Well, the treaty parties are not pushed to do that, you know.
And these reports are exceedingly polite about this existentially threatened continent and the hard issues that face it. For example, a little known public fact is that many states in Antarctica, a globally threatened marine sanctuary, use airguns for a range of sciences, including important research such as gathering climate data. Yet airguns are known to be damaging, even possibly deadly. And I'm quoting peer-reviewed science here, a review study that was recently published, a seminal review study that we reported on. And these issues are emotive, deeply emotive. Jim, we don't have much time left, but I do want to ask you, is there a hesitance to call out Russia and its seismic methods, which would then place the spotlight on seismic blasting by other states? Prospecting and seismic blasting are not always related, but to activists, that may be beside the point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's some truth to what you say, because there are a number of countries that carry out seismic activities for what appears to me to be legitimate science. But that doesn't mean that using the air guns is necessarily the correct thing to be doing. And over the years, over the last 20, 25 years, there have been several attempts by the NGOs to raise the acoustic issues. There's a lot happening, as I see Sean Pryor in the chat saying that Sean represents ASOC at the International Maritime Organization on all kinds of shipping and polar code issues. And there's a lot of work going on there. But the work, the science, of which there's a lot around the world, and I'll say over the last 20 years, it proves these seismic activities are harmful to not just whales, but even to fish, perhaps even to the larval stages of some creatures and so forth. And it's never been rolled up into one debating point at a treaty meeting or a CAMLR meeting. And I think perhaps it's time for that to happen again. The governments, if they wanted to, could take more serious steps to be, again, transparent about what they are doing. Is it really necessary? Is there a second way, another way to get what they're looking for without using the air guns, and at least to regulate the air guns? And I think that would be an important discussion. But so far, as I say, you need, besides ASOC raising all the things that we try to raise and keep accountable the countries, you always need one or more champion countries who say, this is important. And a lot of times they're triggered to do that by what ASOC or other outside entities say. But if you don't have a government that's willing to say, I want this on the agenda, I want to have a special working group on this, I want to have, I want to take steps to get to the bottom of how we can learn what we're doing on this issue, to take the acoustic noise issues and do something about it. And again, there's only so much bandwidth, and we have a lot of issues on the table, from the long running attempt to get marine protected areas, to protect krill from being caught for stupid reasons so that the animals have enough krill. There's so many issues on the table. But this is an important one, and I would love to see it back at a higher level on the table. And it'd be very interesting if you could convince South Africa to table a paper about it and get the ball rolling on a serious discussion again.
That would be interesting, and it's very intriguing that Environment Minister Barbara Creasy said in parliamentary questions that South Africa is working on some kind of campaign to strengthen ban prohibitions. We have asked for more details. We have not received them yet, but if this is indeed the case, if they are collaborating on some international effort to do just this, then Jim, surely that would be quite historic.
Would be, yeah. I wish you the best of luck on this, and if there's any way that we can help, of course, just call on us. But what you're doing is really important, and I hope it's effective with your government.
Thank you, Jim. We have 5 minutes left. And to wrap up, I would like to read a comment from Elma Pollard, an environmental journalist here in South Africa. Elma says, "Very sad to hear how tardy compliance measures are implemented. Explains why fighting for our environment has such limited positive effects. Internationally, a decision should be taken up front to promote environmental compliance as a top priority for the continued survival on this planet. It's not fair that we have to rely on community policing by brave people who put their lives at stake. When are we going to change this? There is almost no time left to turn this boat around." I would like to end off by focusing on this final statement by Alma. There is almost no time left to turn this boat around. Jim, I don't know about you, but I'm not so sure that many people understand quite how urgent the issues are in Antarctica. Thwaites Glacier is hanging on by its fingernails. The scientists said so themselves in a press release. There is almost no time left to turn this boat around. Let's look at 2048. How should we view 2048? Should we view it as something that is far down the line? Or should we view it as a geopolitical blink of an eye? And in the case of the latter, how then do we create a greater sense of urgency within the Antarctic Treaty space? Should advocacy organizations besides ASOC, and you are doing, you have a big task on your hands. Should more advocacy organizations be angrier and shout louder?
Well, yes, I think the answer is very clearly the more organizations that really did focus to some extent on what's happening in Antarctica would be great and important and would help turn the ship around in a timely way. But I just want to make a couple of observations. I was just in Antarctica on an expedition with Sylvia Earle and a lot of other people who care about Antarctica. And we went there in part to witness what's happening. And what did we see? We saw sea ice extent the lowest level ever. We could get into the Weddell Sea where Shackleton's boat went down easily. We could take our Zodiacs right up to the coves where all these wonderful penguins and seals were hanging out and living their lives. We saw rain. It was 6 degrees when we left Ushuaia, 5 degrees the next day in the Drake Passage and so forth. We saw rainbows. You're not supposed to see rainbows in Antarctica, but that's what we saw. Coming up close to huge tabular glaciers, you just see the water dripping off them. The water temperatures up in areas where we were was 3 or 4 degrees. The water temperature shouldn't be 4 degrees. That's under the Thwaites Glacier that you just mentioned. The temperature they got on their drilling sample last year, 4 degrees, under the Thwaites Glacier. So Antarctica, in a sense, is the biggest canary in the coal mine, in my view. And governments have yet to, and not just governments at the international level, governments at a national level have yet to grip the reality. Antarctica is trying to tell us what our future looks like if we don't take immediate action on carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. And so I came back with an urgency that I haven't felt for a long time, but I wish more governments could just see it for themselves, ponder what it means for their children and their grandchildren, and finally turn off the addiction we have to fossil fuels.
Jim, an extraordinary and insightful hour it has been. Thank you for your time. It has been deeply valuable hearing from your irreplaceable store of knowledge.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
And then I would like to thank our sponsors, APSA, for their continued support of our investigations. Finally, if you'd like to stay up to speed on all our latest Antarctic news, at Our Burning Planet, we hope to do more work that will hold great powers to account for how they manage Earth's climate engine and unmined frontier. Our team, I will ask them to share our newsletter link in the chat, and you can sign up for that. For now, to you, the viewer, thanks for joining us. Till next time, goodbye.